Turn to Amos chapter 9. We will be doing a little bit of fishing around in Amos, certainly in Amos chapter 1, a bit of chapter 2, a bit of chapter 5, and chapter 9, and we'll also get into Acts. So you can keep up. I will put verses on the board. I possibly won't stop. So as you get interest, please, you can look at the screen and hopefully keep up with some of the verses that I'll be looking for. But the main text is really Amos chapter 9 and the justice of the coming king. Okay. Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. That's a quote from Micah chapter 6, verse 8. I wonder if that's you this evening. Is that you this evening? In terms of being outward, our outward expression of our faith of Jesus Christ, is it justice? Do we care for each other? Do we care for the oppression of other people around us? Do we want to get involved in the mess of other people's lives? Inwardly, do we love mercy? Are we the kind of person that loves the mercy of God, dwells on it, reads it in the Bible, loves all the doctrines of grace? Upwardly, towards God, are we humble? Do you see that? Different directions pulling us in different directions. Normally, when you're pulled in all sorts of directions, it can be a little bit uncomfortable. And so with God likes to keep us in tension. And sometimes we find it far easier not to be in tension. I wonder if you this morning have a particular bent towards one of those things. You know, which kind of camp are you in? Are you the kind of the social justice warrior that's always trying to help other people? But, you're not really so bothered about, doctrine and getting into the study or really humbling yourself. You want to lord it over that you're helping people. Maybe you're the person that loves mercy, you love the Bible, you love poring over all that Jesus Christ has done for you, but actually you don't care two hoots of what happens to anybody around you. And in fact, you look down on them and you exalt yourself. Maybe you're the humble person that just likes to have the humble walk with the Lord, that just walks with them, and you're so humble that it's almost a false humility, that you wouldn't dare to go out of your way to help somebody. I'm not good enough for that, or I'm not good enough to perhaps read my Bible, I'm not intellectual enough for that. Now maybe we're one of those things, maybe we're two of those things, maybe we're all three of those things, maybe we're none of those things. So I want to open with, which category would you broadly say that you're in? If that is a category. Now, you may have noticed in our culture that our culture tends to have a pull and a draw on us. And in these areas, we can be pulled and tugged. And in our culture, certainly at the moment, there's an area of justice that is very much in vogue, that is pulling us and pulling the church even to justice. I wonder if you've heard the term, the SJW, the social justice warrior. We, in our society, break down into different groups. Each group is a victim and each group has its justice agenda. Race, gender, age, sexuality, religion, nationality, class, ability. And these are good things. It's a good thing that in our culture that we're talking about justice. It's one of the real good things. We should always look at our culture and praise them for looking at good things. It's a category that as Christians we can really get into. There's a real rooting for the gospel in the area of justice, because justice is a huge part of the gospel message. But there is an issue. If the whole justice area pulls too hard on the church, we can go down a route of the social justice gospel, which is partial gospel, but anything that is partial gospel is false gospel. So here we come to Amos, and Amos really, the book's whole backdrop is injustice. Some people use it as a pretext to talk about the social justice gospel. So we're going to look at tonight, really, what truly is justice, God's justice. Somebody once said that God's justice needs no adjectives. There is just justice, God's justice. And as we come to this passage, we find a context in which Israel has divided from Judah. The Davidic dynasty is teetering in the south. The Davidic dynasty is continuing. It is roughly stable. The kings are at least reigning into the decades. But in the northern kingdom, it's far less stable. You know, the reign of the kings on average was really in the years. It was suffering from all sorts of assassinations and coups. But the time that Amos writes is in the time of Jeroboam II. It's about 150 years after the split of the kingdom. And it was relatively, for the northern kingdom, really quite stable, really stable. It was the longest dynasty of about 90 years. Since Jehu led his coup and assassinated a whole host of people. And it was also the longest reign. Jeroboam II reigned for about 30 years. There was peace not long before. You might remember in Jonah, Jonah had prophesied to Nineveh, to the enemy, the Assyrians, and Nineveh had repented. And from what we can gather is that it had brought some kind of stability and peace to Israel. They didn't have to worry about the enemy from the north. And Israel being on the crossroads of the world and the trade route, with Assyria in the north, Babylon in the east, Egypt in the south, it was on the crossroads of the whole marketplace and the trade routes of the world. And it was getting into prosperity. But here's the bad thing. What we read in Amos is that the rich had 2 homes, the poor had none. The rich could bribe the judges. You know, just money paid the way. There was no justice. The poor suffered at the hands of the judges. They would sell the poor into debt slavery just at a drop of a hat for the tiniest amount. And they were mixing their religion with idols of Asherah, Anat, Baal. They were mixing in the idols of sex, war, weather, you name it. They were mixing it in. Does this ring a bell in society? Does this kind of human injustice ring with you? So what is God's justice like? Let's have a little look. So if you turn to chapter 1, and if you cast your eye down in chapter 1, repeatedly it says that God would send fire, consume, and cut off. And he goes around all of Israel's neighbors. In Damascus, verse 3, he would cut them off for their cruelty. In Gaza, he would cut them off for their brutality. For Tyre, their treachery in verse 9. And that's just Israel's neighbors. And then he comes into Israel's cousins. In Edom, he's going to cut them off for their ruthlessness. Remember, Edom was the descendants of Esau. They were cousins to Israel. Ammon and Moab in verse 13 and chapter 2, verse 1, they were descendants of Lot. And that was mainly for their barbarity and their profanity. And then as God circles in, he then gets down to Judah, Israel's sister in the south, and he indicts them for rejecting the law in chapter 2, verse 5. Now, if you were Israel and you were in the north, you would love this. You would really love this. Because remember that day when Israel was saved from Egypt, the oppressors, those who put them into slavery. And there was that day of salvation. And they would always hope when they enacted the Passover that there would also too be a day when God and the day of the Lord would come and that he would save them again from their enemies. And you would think at this moment that, wow, if you're Israel, the day of the Lord's going to come. His justice is going to come and save them from their enemies. But what God does is he's just circling around and getting into his target, Israel. And he says, chapter 2, verse 7, those who trample the head of the poor into the dusts of the earth. He indicts Israel for their injustices. And then he says in verse 10 to 13 of chapter 2, it was I who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Is it not indeed so, O people of Israel? Basically saying to Israel, you were once oppressed and now you're the oppressors. Chapter 2, 6 and 7, it says, because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They were just going to get whatever they could. And he says, you can forget about the day of the Lord. Chapter 5, verse 18 and verse 27, he says, woe to you who desire the day of the Lord. I will send you into exile beyond Damascus. In fact, he's saying the day of the Lord is going to be coming for you, Israel. And he actually says that they're going to go into exile beyond Damascus. That's saying you're going to go north into Assyria. And that's indeed what happens to them. Now, the point here is that when it comes to God's justice, it is universal and it's inevitable. It may not happen in this earth time, but in eternity, nobody gets away. Nobody gets away with sin. Doesn't matter about our nationality, our heritage, our attendance of church. Even nature kind of says that you don't get away with things. And sometimes we believe that we do, and sometimes maybe we do. But just think about this example. You wake up one morning and you're spiritually depressed, beyond belief. You've no idea why. It's so bad, it takes you to the counselor, to the psychiatrist's chair. And typically in the psychiatrist's chair, they will start asking you some questions. They're going to start digging around. They will dig around and ask to find out what's been happening in the past. How have you got to this point? And it's not always the case, but in many cases, they will get back to some act of abuse, some act of trauma, some action of guilt, perhaps some moment of sin that individual has done. Or maybe it's not the sin that they've done, but it's the sin that somebody else has done, an abuse that somebody else has wreaked upon them. That in this fallen world, something horrific has happened to them. Sin has tentacles. And even if we think that we get away with things, quite often, sometimes psychologically, we never do. But even if we get away with it, not in eternity, will we ever escape the justice of God. I just wonder, what do you think this evening you have got away with? Have you? Do you really think, if you were to think about it? And will you in eternity? The next point is that his justice flows from true worship. If you just look at Amos chapter 5, verse 24, this is what he says about their worship. And there's two big things in Amos. One is the injustice, but then he also likes to talk about their worship. And there seems to be a connection of the two. He says, take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your harps I will not listen. but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. This is a rejection of their worship. It doesn't matter what your worship is. If you go out and behave horrifically, it is true indication that really you may not be a Christian. You see, it's our vertical relationship with God that dictates our horizontal relationship with people. Some of you will be familiar with Romans chapter 3, verse 28. He says that, for we hold that one is justified by faith apart from works. The gospel is not to do with works. It's not all to do with justice. But it's the vertical faith that we have in our God. And it is that kind of justice. Let's get our justice right vertically first. And then if you were to read James chapter 2, verse 17, he gives the flip side. He says, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. If you're justice with God and you are right with God, then justice and righteousness will flow. See that in chapter 5, verse 24? He says, I'm not interested in your worship because there's no justice with it. But the justice that I desire, the worship that I desire, is the worship of a person who is interested in justice and righteousness. Now, here's just a quick definition. What we mean by righteousness is, in a simple sense, having right relationships. On the horizontal level, it's the right relationships that we have with each other, despite our differences. And there's righteousness with God. And justice. Justice is really the actions that we make and we do to make our relationships right. That's called justification. Making somebody right, first and foremost, with God. And this is the kind of worship that God wants, and his justice is linked to his worship. That's true worship. But here's the flip side. If our justice and our worship are linked together, it's also true that the injustices that we do are often linked to the idols that we worship. Israel were in this position of injustice because of the idols they were worshiping. If we're a husband here tonight, a man, we're quite bent on things. We can worship our careers, our leisure times. We can worship anything that moves and does stuff. And we get drawn in to the detriment of our wives, to the relationships that we have, and the tyranny that we bring on our families because we are just worshiping one single thing. Wives, we're probably more relational. Women, we're more relational. We might be drawn to our relationships, to our families, to our homes. If we worship that above God, we can devour our children. Huge psychological problems. We want to smother our children because we worship them. And all we're bringing is tyranny on our children. If we're a young person, we might worship image, sex. If we go down that line and we worship that idol, we can bring tyranny upon the future relationships when we do actually want to settle down and have a relationship with somebody, and we've psychologically screwed ourselves up and the person that we're doing whatever we're doing with. Sin has effects, and we get the injustices of the idols that we worship. So that's pretty miserable, isn't it? I've painted a pretty miserable picture. The justice of God. But here's the hope. Where is the hope? Right, we're going to get to Amos chapter 9. And now we come to our passage. The hope, first and foremost, is that there is a new king. That there is a new king. Amos points forward, and this is obviously talking of Jesus Christ and his kingdom, about the Messiah. It says that in that day I will raise up the booth of David that has fallen, and repair its breaches, and raise up its ruins, and rebuild it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom, and all the nations who are called by my name, declares the Lord who does this. In this image, we have the booth, the tent, the tabernacle of David. This is really a picture of the extent of David's rule and his kingdom. And it's recognizing that David's rule is broken. One, because the kingdom is divided. Another, because Amos has just prophesied that the north is going to be lost into exile. It's not going to be long before Judah goes into exile into Babylon. You know, in terms of David's tent and his rule, it's going to be flat. But here's hope. Because here's hope of a new king, where first of all, it talks about Edom, that the land would be restored. Edom itself was only ever subjugated by Israel under David. They were up in the hills, they were a difficult group of people to conquer, and it was only achieved under David. And here we have a picture of David, of the Davidic king, restoring Israel, and some people weigh quite heavily on that. But there's also, it says, and all the nations who are called by my name. That this kingdom would not be limited just to Israel, but all the Gentiles, all the nations would become under this king. Now, this is where we get into Acts chapter 15. We read this earlier. Now, Acts chapter 15, interesting that the context was actually in one way you could look at it, is an issue of injustice. You had two groups of people, two racial groups. You had the Jews and you had the Gentiles. And there was potential for oppression. The Jews were saying to the Gentiles, for you to be a Christian, you need to become a Jew first. And he talks about the yoke on their neck. He talks about it in oppressive ways. Now, if you were just to think about it, they were suggesting that the Gentiles needed to be circumcised. Now, if you just think that through in your head for a moment, and what you would need to do that, I think if I were certainly there at that time, I might feel slightly oppressed at the thought that I might be circumcised. There was potential injustice. You had the liberty of the Jews, of the Gentiles, potentially being oppressed by the Jews. And also there was an oppression potentially the other way around. The Gentiles were so liberal and free, and their idol worship was leaking into the church, and their sexuality was leaking into the church, and it would offend the Jews. And they come, Peter, Barnabas, James, and they have something different here. They're not just pitting one person's justice against another person's justice. They come and look at the justice of God. And they put themselves under the king's justice, under Christ's justice. And they work out at the end a sensible, they go to the truth. And James comes back to the truth of Amos chapter 9 and says, the justice is for the Gentiles as well. If you were to read Matthew chapter 12, verse 18, it says this, behold my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, talking about Jesus Christ, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. That justice, God's justice, was going to the Gentiles as well. So there's hope of a new king with his reign. There's also hope of new worship. When you look at that passage and in chapter 9 and verse 11, it talks about this booth or this tent or this tabernacle. Some have referred this to David's tabernacle on Mount Zion. Now, if you remember, there was Moses' tabernacle, and when David had brought the ark back into Jerusalem, Moses' tabernacle was still back in Shiloh, and it was empty. David had brought the Ark of the Covenant, the presence of the Lord, into Jerusalem, put it on Mount Zion, and he erected a tent. And as far as we know about this tent, David celebrated a Feast of Booths, and there's no instruction about what this tent actually looked like. As far as we know, there was no holy place, there was no veil, there was no courtyard, there were no implements. David had erected Levites to serve in front of the ark. It wasn't just limited to the high priest. And there was singing, all these different things compared to Moses' tabernacle. And it's an image of the future kingdom, the future Davidic king, where true worship, true access to God would happen. That in the justice of Christ's kingdom, true worship would be restored. There were no animal sacrifices in David's tabernacle. This is the picture of the justice and righteousness of God flowing in his kingdom and through his people. And then lastly, we have a new kingdom. It says in Amos chapter 9, verse 13, it says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes, him who sows the seed. The mountains shall drip sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow with it." Now, this is a picture of the land of the kingdom. The picture of the kingdom like Israel had never ever seen, and had never seen in later times. Even now, Israel are not in this state. And it's hard to imagine that at any point you would ever see anything like this on earth. It is hyperbolic to the extreme. It's talking about people going out into the fields, and in the fields, that literally those who are harvesting the corn, the fruit of the land is coming out so quickly, and it's growing so quickly that the people who are sowing for the next year can't get in the fields to sow the next seed. There's super abundance. This is a picture of a kingdom that you've never seen. Now, this might picture a spiritual reality in the church and a superabundance there, but ultimately, it's really a picture of a reversal of Eden. If you were to compare the curse of Eden, and remember in Eden when Adam and Eve sinned, and God found them out, and God comes to them and says to them, "What have you done?" And Eve says, "It wasn't me, it was the snake. I'm a victim of the snake." And God then says to Adam, "What have you done?" Adam says, "It's the woman." And then he doesn't say that he's the victim of the woman. He then says, "It was the woman whom you gave me." I'm a victim of God. That's a human attitude. We're just victims of God. And then God pronounces his judgment on them. In his justice, he says, "Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth to you. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to the dust you shall return." But now we have the picture of the new kingdom. That in the justice of God, there in this new kingdom, there's now going to be a way of the reversal of all of that. Astonishing. Great hope to be relieved from this justice that God will bring. Now here's my appeal as we close, and we're running out of time. And here's the thing. We just need to talk a little bit about Jesus Christ in more specific terms. We've looked at the hope of the kingdom, of the king, of his worship. But how was it accomplished? When they were talking in Acts and they were referring and working these things out in the early church, it was all because they believed in this new Messiah, this king, Jesus Christ, because something that happened on a cross. All of this was accomplished through the greatest injustice ever. And that's the huge irony of the gospel. It's the huge paradox. It's the thing that makes it so profound that God brings about righteousness. He brings about righteous living between us and God in a right worshipful relationship, and can bring about right relationship in the world because of the biggest injustice in history. Arrest, trial, crucifixion of Jesus Christ. No victim of injustice was ever more innocent than the sinless Son of God. We're talking about God. You couldn't get anybody higher and bring him so low and kill him. He was sinless. He was innocent. Did anyone suffer more agony than Jesus? I mean, he was executed, and he was executed by people who knew he was innocent. And to add insult to injury, Barabbas, a murderous, thieving insurrectionist, they set him free. The greatest travesty of justice the world has ever seen. If we were to look at Jesus' kingship on the cross, they put a crown of thorns, a purple robe. They even put a sign above him that said, "King of the Jews." Pilate said, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the crowd replied, "We have no king but Caesar." He was the king. They knew he was the king. In terms of the true worship, where on the moment that Jesus Christ died and he gave up his breath, it says Jesus cried out again and with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit, and behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. True worship, new worship, you could have access into the holy place, you could be right with God, and you could dwell with him because of it. And then when you look at the kingdom and the land, do you remember the thief on the cross? Luke chapter 23:42. And the thief who probably was getting his just desserts, it was probably totally just that he was there dying for what he had done. He turns to Jesus and says, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus turned and said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." That's the new kingdom. That's what we saw in Amos. That's all of the promises of this wonderful new kingdom where justice would be restored. And like the thief, all that we have to do is ask him, can we be there? I wonder if you've asked that tonight. Now, just to be clear, Jesus was no victim of social injustice. Yes, there was social injustice. But this was part of God's humble plan of justice and mercy. It was God's wrath against sin that was placed upon Jesus, who took the punishment for us. It was the plan of God. This was not, the world defuncting him. This is great mercy because all of the wrath was put on Jesus instead of us if we would accept him. That is great mercy. Great mercy. That in God's justice there is great mercy for us all. That's great hope for us. I just want to leave you with this. Do you love this kind of mercy? Do you love this kind of mercy? Do you do this kind of justice? Do you walk this kind of humility? In Jesus Christ we see justice, mercy, and humility. So I'll repeat what I said at the beginning. Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God.